Hello, friends. Bryan from the Arena Decklist podcast here, back to answer some more patron questions. I explained this last week, but every week over on our podcast, you obviously know we take questions from our patrons, and they love trolling me and making me miserable. As you see, I asked for questions as we got ready to record our Theros Top 10 show, specifically clarified that we would address things like, is Uro good? And you see the first two questions I get. Kanye, if you weren't bigger and stronger than me, I would fight you next time I saw you. Not that I've ever seen you in person. But still, we'll skip these troll questions and we'll move on to Jeff Pica's questions. Worst card in the set that people will still try to play. That's an interesting one. Trying to think of the type of card that people are historically drawn to no matter how bad it is. Usually some type of large, ineffectual creature without immediate value on the battlefield. Let's go with the 6/1 with protection from random things. I think it's just going to get blown up in too many spots. The mana cost is super restrictive, and it doesn't have any other synergies that'll push you into that color. Woe Striders, Pioneer Applications. So we talked a bit about this on the cast. There's already Nantuko Husk available, and that hasn't really set the world on fire. This might be a little bit better. And you can certainly see some type of aristocrats type things coming together, but the mana in Pioneer is so bad. I think you're just incentivized to play pretty fair. I expect Woe Strider to mostly miss unless there's something infinite you can do with it that is benefited by Woe Strider's presence. So the Scry being really, really meaningful and being able to escape the Woe Strider from the graveyard. Nothing really pops to mind yet. DT Lurch, how does this set line up with the expectations outlined in the Oko Apology article /fire? I don't know that I could give you a quick and dirty summation of what that article promised. My biggest takeaway was that power level of Throne was supposed to be the norm, not an aberration. This set does not reflect that. So that either tells me that they are not particularly adept at assessing power level. Like, there is nothing as egregious as Once Upon a Time in this set, not even close to anything like Once Upon a Time, where you just see it and are immediately repulsed. And I don't think there's anything along the same lines of Oko where it's super cheap and the game is shaped around it. Now, granted, Oko wasn't as immediately apparent. It became quickly apparent as soon as you played games with it. Having played games in a few spots now, I don't see anything that is even in the range of those kind of mistakes. So I don't really know what to make of that, given that they were trying to set us up for super high power levels, which is a strange thing to do, because now if it slips a little bit, people are possibly somewhat disappointed. So I don't really know what to make of that article on the whole. I think it didn't effectively address the concerns that people were having to start with. So I wouldn't use it as a guidepost going forward. It seemed a little cobbled together without a really clear mission statement. Delver Guy, your question was answered. We talked about the effect Pioneer will have on the PTs on this week's cast. Pretty low on it outside of Heliod, actually. Not seeing a whole lot here. And that kind of speaks to the whole Throne of Eldraine thing, because Pioneer is ostensibly based on Throne of Eldraine, and there's already been a bunch of bans targeting the format, and I don't see the same type of inroads being made by this new Theros set. Teleria wants to know, why is Elspeth the most overlooked card in the set? Elspeth needs a very specific home. People trying to play it as just this fair card, I don't think it does anywhere near enough. Like, that doesn't mean it's unplayable and you can find spots where having one in your deck is super meaningful, because escape means you always have one. And that can be valuable for control strategies. So I'm totally fine with playing it in small numbers. I think that makes a bunch of sense, and it makes a bunch of sense in a bunch of decks. But in terms of being a format defining card, I do not see that for Elspeth. That's not where she lies on my radar right now. Most interesting build-arounds, asks Quinn O'Grady. I think it's Thassa by a large margin. There's so many interesting things to do with Thassa, and also super, super powerful as well. So that's been the card that I have built the most around. I am really into it. Is there any engines that look like they can compete with the food engine? Yeah, the mana engines in this set are preposterous. There's stuff like Nyx Bloom Ancient, which is its own type of engine, and all the Thassa blinking stuff gets out of control really quickly. Mono blue devotion setups are this incredible value engine. So I do think some of this stuff is on pace with the food engine. Is it going to overcome that engine? Not sure yet. Still very early. Feingrish wants to know what conditions are different between RTR THS and RTR TR THB, and how does that change your views on gods, devotion, returning mechanics, etc.? I don't think I can answer that question. I would just have to look very carefully at the format at the release of original Theros, and that's so far removed from my mind that I can't really put forth a good answer here. Andrew W. wants to know what. Let me get it in frame. Andrew W. wants to know what are the non-THB cards you're most excited about reevaluating in the light of this set? All the 4 pip cards, all the devotion cards, things like Arcanist Owl. It's really nice to see that shine. Every single one at least merits consideration in a bunch of spots. I have put them in a bunch of decks because devotion's a thing again, and it's cool to have them turned back on. Craigsy, what are the biggest mistakes you believe people make in card evaluation? They don't consider analogs and replacement options. So like a card can be good, but if it's just doing the same job as some other card, it doesn't really matter all that much, except in terms of potential churn where one can find a sweet spot. But in terms of shaping the format and what the new best deck is going to be, then I am not impressed when a card has a very, very close analog. Eleonora Rose wants to know, clearly discussion of Heliod has significantly impacted the conversation around Pioneer. Do you feel this discussion has overshadowed any important additions to the format that people aren't discussing enough? Mostly no. And it's weird. I mean, I expected to find a bunch of stuff for Pioneer in this set, but honestly, nothing is blowing me away right now. It's mostly Heliod, and we need to unpack a lot about that card and how it affects the format. I think it's narrower than people believe. I think you just improved your mono white decks for the most part, and it's not about splashing Heliod Ballista into everything. So maybe this is a low impact set for the format, or maybe I'm just missing a bunch. I mean, I do think things like Dream Trawler are good potential finishers in the blue-white control decks, which they were missing to some extent. It's nice for them to actually be able to end a game. Sandcron, what was the spot or card that you two fought and argued over its position on this top 10 the most? Probably Nightmare Shepherd. Not that either of us dislikes the card. We were both on board. It was just a question of what was going to represent the mono black stuff. And if Grey Merchant wasn't a reprint, it would probably be that. But there was a lot of talk around Ephemia, the Cacophony, and other good like black enchantment cards that we thought were worthy of highlighting. Ultimately, we went with Nightmare Shepherd on the belief that it just does more things and can appear in more potential places than any of the other black cards. Kira wants to know, in these super connected and collaborative times, can we expect a 3-month standard to not be pseudo-solved or stale? Do you think Wizards needs to do... What do you think Wizards needs to do to design/adjust for the longevity of standard? It's harder. It's certainly harder. The main thing is that you do need kind of flat power level. You need a lot of cards that are good options, and when there are these huge outliers, cards like Nissa, obviously cards like Oko, cards like Once Upon a Time, Field of the Dead, it's very hard for there to be the appropriate churn. If you go back to Ravnica Allegiance, which was the last time standard really shined in my eyes, it was all about making small adjustments to archetypes, but mostly the archetypes were able to hang tight throughout with a few new pop-ups here and there. That's what you're trying to do, I think. You're trying to make it so your archetypes are in pretty clear buckets, But those buckets, I mean, you want like a good number of them, 5, 6 buckets, but all within those buckets, they're churning the entire time and adapting to what's good and finding new technology. And that's the best way to keep standard uh, live for as long as possible. Adam Goodall, what do you think is a card in the new Theros set that is currently the most underrated? Specifically, is there a card you didn't put on your top 10 list but still think is a good card everyone seems to be sleeping on at the moment? We had some honorable mentions, which sort of filled that role. I do think the 2 mana ramp spell, I'm still wrapping my name around all the cards, or still wrapping my head around the name of all the cards, so sorry if I'm shortcutting a little bit. You'll have to look it up. 2 mana ramp spell that enchants your land. Very impactful. It can play well with Nissa as well in terms of double ramp in those scenarios, and just having a 2 mana ramp spell that isn't vulnerable to creature removal is a big deal. I don't know that a lot of people recognize that. It also plays well with Kiora, by the way, which is a card that has been unlocked a little bit. So I would keep a close eye on that enchantment for sure. Il Maestro, do you feel the set design plays pretty exclusively into the someone gets to do an insanely powerful thing and the game is over in a slaughter play patterns that Todd was lamenting on his stream yesterday? Yes, I do. Absolutely. I don't think that's a problem with this set, though. I think that's mostly a problem with the older cards. It's hard to evaluate when cards like Nissa are so snowbally and so ubiquitous. It's hard to understand the isolated role of the other set. But I do agree that it's a problem. Clothis remains on the top 4 most expensive mythics. I still don't see any applications for it. What am I missing? Go listen to the podcast. Card is very good. Red Necro, what is the one card that the two of you have had the widest opinion on in the set? I'm entirely sold that Allure of the Unknown is going to be a player, but what about you guys? Don't think that card's good enough. Draw 5 somehow doesn't matter anymore, and you have such huge deck building restrictions to try and maximize it. I know I wrote an article about it, trying to make it work. I don't think I quite got there. As far as gulf of opinion, I'm trying to think if there was an instance where one of us was like over the moon about a card and the other one was just like, no, don't see it whatsoever. And there really wasn't. We were pretty close in our opinion for a lot of the time that we were working with this set. Maybe when we started it was the first Heroin games, but once I laid out my vision for the card, Jerry came on board pretty quickly. So that tightened up a lot. And maybe the importance of the Wraths, even though we ultimately included White Wrath on our top 10, I think we do have differing opinions on how important Wraths will be in this format. Delver guy, is it going to be a live recording? Guess not. Time has passed for that. The Goodo, Kelton, what is the difference between Outlaws and In-Laws? I don't have an answer for that. Assurin, how will your top 10 cards affect the format? Let's think about the top 10 list and what it ultimately does. It's weird because our top 3 cards are all very, very linear. I would say that 2 of the top 3 cards being devotion based cards, again, points to the importance of being able to wrath your opponent. If these decks establish their devotion engines and can do whatever the devotion stuff is, their payoffs that they get for having all these pips on the battlefield, they will do very, very strong things. So there will be even more decks playing to the battlefield, and I think that is exploitable and possibly a focal point of the standard. Mirhi, do you think that engine decks are too prominent in standard the past few years? Would you like to return to games that were more about efficient trading of resources rather than chips passing the night? 100%. Absolutely. Tim Frank, the forecast for aggro looks dim in Theros constructed. Do you think there will be viable aggro decks early in the format? Not traditional aggro decks. I think you can attack. I think you can close games quickly, but it looks different than mono red used to look, and mono red in particular has taken some beatings lately. So that archetype is basically gone. But I do think there are aggressive white decks. I do think Knights, despite getting no upgrades, is fine if people start slipping. But it's definitely, of the 3 pillars, it's way further down. Pioneer right now feels underexplored. Why do you think the format has just been getting more and more fair despite the broad and powerful card pool? No incentives to break it yet. I am very curious what happens at the PT. Everyone will turn their sights with these large, powerful testing teams focused on the format. Maybe there's something you can push on a little bit harder to break it. There's also the Underworld card, the red card that lets you escape all your cards, which has potential in Pioneer 100%. I know you're already working on it, yo man, and I'm right there with you. I think it is something that could be very good. There's obviously the Lotus field decks. I don't know that they've gotten any kind of improvements recently, but starting to see Niv Mizzet pop up, which maybe that's fair and doesn't push into the unfair territory, but it certainly exploits other fair decks, right? You're generating tremendous resources and kind of going over the top of these fair decks now. Maybe that'll push people to getting these unfair decks online. Marrowwhack, do you think allied temples make choosing a 3-color deck, especially the shard colors, worth it over the more stable 2-color mana bases, assuming you're not interested in something like Nissa? It all depends what your deck is attempting to do. There's no rule that this many colors is correct or that many colors is correct. It's about what game plans can you enable in 2-color decks, what game plans do you start to get access to when you have 3 and 4-color decks, and how do those compare versus the slightly higher consistency of the 2-color decks. Firemine 12, are there any previously unplayable cards from prior sets, feel free to go back as far as you like, that you think will jump into the spotlight as a result of one or more cards from THB? The 4 pip cards, 100%. Emma, what are y'all's method for determining if a new card is going to end up being a pillar of the format? It's easy to evaluate that proves its ability to hang, obviously, but with newer cards, it's rough. Identifying a pillar is harder than just like, this card is good. And a lot of my efforts in top 10 prognostication is about finding the potential for cards to become pillars. And I put a large premium on cards that I see having that potential over just like fair removal spell, utility card. It's more about finding the pillars for me. How do I do that? It's mostly finding cards that are playing on a different axis than everything else. And again, that's that whole evaluation of cards with similar roles. It's about finding cards with new roles that do things unlike anything else in the format. I think something like Thassa does a good job checking that box, really pushing your synergies to the next level. The Blink engine, the ability to steal things from your opponent and permanently gain control of them, all that stuff seems very meaningful to me. Uro kind of fails in that regard, where it's just another good blue-green ramp spell, but it's so strong on its face and so mana efficient and capable of taking over a game on its own while just being your ramp spell that I am fine in that case, pushing it very, very high on my list. But by traditional metrics, cards like Heliod, Thassa do way more to unlock a lot of cards around them. That's a good metric too. Like, how many new cards are thrust into the spotlight because of the existence of this card? That's a really strong indicator that this could be a pillar of the format. Drew Pendergast wants to know, will the curve of Nightmare Shepherd into Gary, somehow dying and triggering again be the best thing to be doing? Certainly felt so when I was brewing. I was very high on mono black. Reports seem like it remains viable. People are okay with mono black, although maybe not over the moon. I will tell you, it's weird. Nothing's really coming out where people are just nuts about a particular deck right now. I'm pretty into the mono green devotion deck I've been working on. It has a lot of different options, plays a bunch of game plans, does absurd things, which is the biggest like pushing point for me to explore it further, is that when it does its thing, it's just absolutely bonkers. But even then, I'm not like, this is clearly the best thing to be doing in the format. It's just a really powerful option that I want to explore some more. So hard to say what the best thing is right now. I don't think we're getting the same type of clarity when people don't have an event for 2 weeks. Things are slowing down a little bit as far as that goes. Prophylaxis, Stephen Yeen says, people say that Magic has a lot of variance, but the same people keep top 8 and do consistently well each week on the SCG tour. Are those people just better than everyone else, or there's a secret to their success? Buys help a tremendous amount on the SCG tour. Getting those buys makes a very large difference. and that plays into seeing the same people over and over. They are the best players on the tour. You watch them play; they play at a higher level than their competition, and the gulf is pretty broad between the lower end of the SCG tour and the very top end. Um, More so, I think, than PTs certainly, GPs maybe. I'm pretty sure that's the case, that the gulf is still larger, so that helps a lot. They also have established teams in place. They also play every event, so they know the stresses, they know the flow of these events, they're comfortable, they're in their element. All those things matter. But that's what makes them the best players, is that they have put in the time and they have formed these skill sets. So I'm not trying to diminish their accomplishments. They are better than everyone else. And just being able to hang on the tour for that long and find a way to make it work. I mean, there's other factors, obviously. There's the financial ability to do so and the time to travel that much and all the things that come with devoting yourself to Magic all play into it. But also, these people are just very good and have worked very hard in their games and certainly uh, deserve their successes. Makatzel, how do you determine if you're overreacting or underreacting to recent results, technology, cards? It's just this weird self honesty that you have to build up. And there's a lot of incentives to overreact, honestly. Like if you tell people, oh, I think this deck is solid and there's something there, we should put in some time and find the correct configuration, they'll scroll right past that. They're not interested in hearing about that. If you say, whew, this deck is really absurd, it's starting to do busted things, say that trigger word, busted, uh, people are generally drawn in, and you might get the support you need to keep evolving that deck. So there's kind of perverse incentives in place to overreact, and that makes it even harder for us to be honest with ourselves and understand what we have access to and what we are ultimately achieving and how good our deck's technology evaluations ultimately prove to be. It's like anything else, really. The more honest you are with yourself, the better position you are in. And honesty with yourself isn't always a decision you make, it's a learned skill. So holding yourself accountable can do a lot to getting to a place where you're being honest with yourself more often. If you go back and check the mistakes you made and say, wow, I really mucked this one up, not as good as I thought, my mistake, I think you will be more apt in the future to not get ahead of yourself. Liam Kahalan wants to know, what's something that didn't make your list but you want to be wrong about? Dream Trawler, which is weird because it's kind of an annoying card, but ultimately, like, I believe this card to be very, very powerful. Am I even calling it the right name? I don't even know. You know what card I'm talking about. Blue-white, hexproofy thing, lifelink. I think it's called Dream Trawler. I think this card's very powerful. It obviously has some similarities to Baneslayer Angel, has the hexproof thing working, all this huge points in its favor. And it didn't get a spot in my top 10 because, one, I think it's super narrow and only appears in really one deck. A lot of that is due to its mana cost. The other thing is I'm not sure it plays with the format as it's structured. And that goes back to that snowbally stuff we're talking about and these huge turns with Nissas and tremendous Crazies, and all of that stuff puts me in a place where I am not jazzed about trying to play what is kind of a fair creature. Like, it's weird to say that about 5/5 lifelink draw a card, but when you're making 12/12 Crazises, it can look kind of quaint in some spots. So I want this to be a thing that is viable in the format again, and for us to get away from the engine style decks. I just don't know if it's going to happen though. Genuo, which cards make a good addition to current tier 1 Pioneer decks? Heliod. I'm sorry, I want more than that. That slots right into mono white very, very safely. Is there something in the mono black decks that they can pick up? It's like Drag to the Underworld, but I think that's mostly worse than Grasp in most situations. Maybe that will see some play. That's a pretty clean slot. I mentioned Dream Trawler potentially doing a good job and blocking for the blue-white decks as well as providing a finisher. I could see that card being completely fine. Those are the cards that immediately pop to mind. Alex Vaz. How do you want to work during the first weeks of a format? Find an engine, refine it as much as possible to make it work. Find a good place in a developing metagame. Finding a good linear deck with good plans post sideboard, or just sticking to your plan as much as possible. What would be your recommendation to a player trying to succeed on the first weeks? So week 1 is different from week 2, which is different from week 3, and I think you need to keep that in mind because you're actually asking a bunch of different questions here. If we're just talking about out the gate, day 1, do something as powerful as possible and assume that players will not have adequately prepared for it. And if you do that, I think you'll find yourself in a good place. It changes very quickly once decks have a target on them. You might need to sidestep a little bit. I wrote an article on SCG. It will be free now, and it's about succeeding early on in the format and what I try to do. It will do a much better job summing this up than me trying to come up with a fresh answer for you. So I would advise you to go check that out. Quinn O'Grady, Avian Fang. It seemed like the most recent standard was dominated by engine decks. Yep. Going into this new standard, do you think the prevalence of card advantage engines will continue to dominate? Yep. Next, Tortilla Frisbee. How long into a new set should it be before we officially declare a card as busted or jank? Never do those things. It's not a useful definition. Busted probably means this card should be banned, and that's ultimately not a determination we get to make. I don't think there's any answer to this question. There's no set time frame that you should be using when you can say, okay, now is the point where we get to say how good this card is. I mean, Once Upon a Time was obviously insanely busted on its face on day 1. So Oko took a 2-day period before you realized there was a problematic card. Field of the Dead was around and okay for months before it had to be banned. So there's no answer to this question. Andrew W. Follow-up. How do you deal with the Magic community's tendency to turn all nuance into false binaries? I mean, I would love to criticize this, but half my articles end up titled, "This card is busted." So what are you going to do? It's just a way to draw eyeballs, and we have altered our language to mine for social media currency. That's all I'm going to say about it. Goetze? In general, what characteristics make a card have a bigger impact on Pioneer than Standard? And in specific, do you see any cards in THB that are candidates for this? I do think this is a good question. Pioneer hasn't been around long enough for me to really have a sense of this. In Modern, it's just hard what costs 0, what costs 1. And that's a very easy way to understand what cards you need to mostly be considering in that context. Pioneer is a little bit different, and I don't know that I have any real metrics in place to parse this out yet, but I will keep this in mind in the future and think about it and see if I can get to a place where I can actually put forth an answer to this question. Suribepe, which of the gods will see Standard play, and are they good enough to morph the removal in the format to go for more exiling effect? All of them, yes. I think Perforos and Nylea are certainly more narrow, but I expect all the gods to see play. Erebos is a little narrow too. But Heliod, Thassa, and the Red-Green God, all going to be there a lot. Quinn O'Grady, Avian Fane, back for another question. Not a question about the set, but a question about the audience. What is the breakdown of questions? How many are Standard versus Pioneer versus Modern versus Legacy / Vintage? I don't know. I don't keep track of that. You are welcome to scroll up through the questions and come up with these numbers if you would like. Kirby Silver, where is each of your favorite tour stops? Best convention center, best food. I love Richmond. The convention center is fine. It's very close to the hotel usually that we get. Oh, the last time we stayed really far away. I hope we don't do that next time we go to Richmond. But the food is really good. There's Secret Sandwich Society and Jakogi, which are two of my favorite food stops on the tour. So Richmond is the first one to come to mind. Also, the weather is usually like pretty pleasant when we go to Richmond, which is nice. Philadelphia is interesting because we're in the casino. The food is pretty terrible, but being able to just step out of your hotel room and you just go down the elevator and you're there to do your job, that's really cool. I like that convention center a lot. And that's about all I have right now. Crownless, how do you feel about the hesitance to reprint the historic and hexproof keywords in a set with strong auras and enchantments theme. Is there a chance for an auras deck in the competitive meta? There's certainly good auras decks. Setessan Champion is a very, very good card. As far as reprinting historic and hexproof, I hate hexproof. I don't want it anywhere near the game. I'm so happy that we're not going to have to deal with the hexproof auras deck. Historic, whatever. That was the thing for Dominaria. Sometimes they bring these things back, sometimes they don't. Red Noise, Island Go, is Pridemate deck a real tier 2 deck now? Yes. Mono white decks look nice. Maybe with some work and some finesse, it can become a real tier 1 deck even. I think Heliod's a powerful card. Suddenly Pandas says, curious about Bryan losing quite a sum of money to the recent bans. Will this kill his enthusiasm for premium cards, or should players just accept this of a risk of wanting to play at the top tier? So I accept this, and I'm in a position to accept this. Nobody else has to accept this. This is not good for Magic, and consistent bans are problematic. It hurts people to have their wallet attacked, and the whole you should have known you were spending money on Magic anyway. I hate that. It's so lacking in empathy. It's just like, feel bad for people. They lost a portion of their investment. It stinks. For me, it's whatever. I bear some of the risk. I also had a bunch of good buys this year where I turned those good buys into some of these cards. So it is what it is. It's disappointing that things obviously went this far, but I don't harbor any huge ill will towards it. And I don't know, maybe if I hold these long enough, they'll come back to the spot where I purchased them, which is fine. We're probably many, many years away from that, but I just don't get too bent out of shape about it. But it is a real problem, and people have every right to feel like they are not getting exactly what they paid for. Stimmed Archon, favorite pre-release of all time that you played in? When I moved to Las Vegas, they used to have 2-day pre-releases, and you'd have to qualify for day 2 with a 4-1 or a 5-0 in day 1, and it was kind of much more like a mini GP than the in-store pre-releases that we see now. I also didn't know anyone, and I met a bunch of people, whereas I had no friends in Las Vegas when I moved there and wouldn't have known anyone, so that was cool. And also I was mostly not playing paper Magic at that point. In fact, that pre-release might have been the first paper Magic tournament I had played in 12 years or something like that. And I did very well. I finished in the top 4 and got a bunch of boxes, and it was cool to still be able to play in paper and have some success. And it had a lot to do with me getting back into the game wholesale. It wasn't something that I considered a huge part of my identity at that point. It was just something I was doing to fill time and meet some people in a city I didn't know anyone. And I think doing well probably snowballed it a little bit, where Magic became a lot more a part of my life. Jake the Jackal, Jacob Baum, what card surprised you in the new set? What's a card that blew you away in the past that you didn't initially rate highly enough? Certainly Oko. If it wasn't my number 1 card, I didn't rate it high enough. So I do think I said, though, when we were doing the top 10, it wouldn't surprise me if I had to come back and put this as my number 1 card. I'll have to check if I actually did say that. But yeah, I mean, just didn't realize quite how good it was. In this set, Thassa just climbed up so quickly for me, where it was a card I was pretty sure was going to be good, but not all that widely seen. And then you play it just a couple times, and you're like, oh yeah, this is the real deal. Underdog, do you think that Theros will have the competitive impact War ELD had in multi-formats? And if not, are you all excited for that? I think its impact should be less, and I think that is a very good thing. What, in your opinion, is a good way to find a medium in design space between creating an expansion with engaging new tools for Magic as a whole without making them define every format they are used in? A lot of it could be boiled down to mana costs. Oko's probably... No, it's still not good. Oko's bad. I don't have any way to defend that card. I don't know. I'll say sometimes mistakes will get made. You can't do anything about that. This game is too complicated. There's too many moving parts. Mistakes will get made. I would rather have them made in places that leads to interesting games rather than repetitive games. And I think one of the problems with mistakes presently is that they are just leading to repetitive games. So if things are going to be too good, let them be good in novel ways every time. Like, I would rather cards be too good like Teferi or Narset than cards be too good like Oko or Field of the Dead. Now, obviously, I'm talking about cards which were able to survive in Standard and cards that weren't. But there was a point where people were talking about Teferi as a potential ban, and I think somewhat justified in doing so. But that's probably the difference, is that there's multiple uses for that card. Sometimes interesting things happen, whereas Oko, the same game happened every time. Gordy says, despite Wizards' claims that Throne of Eldraine was going to set the power level moving forward, it seems that Theros is significantly less powerful than the three sets which preceded it, with nothing on the level of Oko once, Field and Sorin, or Teferi Nissa. Do you agree with this assessment? Yes, and if so, if not, do you think that's a good thing? It's definitely a good thing. Long-term Magic could not be as powerful as it's been recently. RH Will, what are the ways to abuse the new escape mechanic in any format? Where do you see it in relation to power level compared to Delve? Worse than Delve, because it's unlikely. Well, hold on. Yeah, worse than Delve, because you don't get the free version out of the front side of your hand, and mana reduction is very different from redundancy. So, way worse than Delve. Best ways to abuse it are just like putting the card in your graveyard and never having it go through the battlefield, so it's just a source of card advantage. Anything that directly is depositing things like Liliana seem really promising, where you're taking advantage of the fact that you're breaking the symmetry on the discard and getting to rebuy it from your graveyard. BenBuzz 790, are there any MTG drills you can do to sharpen or speed up your skills? It's a good question. I don't have anything that springs to mind. I think calling games of Magic is a very, very useful thing, because it forces me to understand what's happening in the game very quickly, because I need to convey that information. So maybe some practice play-by-play might do that. I don't know. I will think about this question some more too. Hopefully I can find a good answer for it. Of all the top 10 lists you two have made over the years, which top 10 list of a set was the hardest to make? You see the answer right down there. War of the Spark. It was a disaster. We miffed that top 10 so badly, and it was just because we brought a bunch of assumptions from the previous sets into that set. We assumed that planeswalkers were on the way down. We assumed that you wouldn't make a set with 30 planeswalkers unless you had carefully tempered their power level. All of these assumptions were just completely wrong. The set was the start of a slippery slope that led to some real power creep over the last few sets. And we did not correctly identify that. And I hope to never mess up a set that badly again. I try to check my assumptions when we come into a top 10 about what the format will look like. Although, I mean, I'm talking about a card like Dream Trawler, and maybe I didn't effectively do that. Maybe the format will change so much that just will prove to be a staple. So it's hard. Top 10 lists are hard. I want them to be entertaining. That is my goal. And I want them to provide food for thought. I don't mind if I just miss. I think it's still a valuable piece of content, and you can still learn something from listening to it. That being said, though, I do think I have strived to get better at it, and a lot of that was because of War of the Spark and how badly we missed. So, I hope you all enjoyed this Q&A session. I gave an ultimatum over on the podcast this week, where I said if, I don't know what I said, 4,000 or 5,000 people didn't come and watch this, I was not going to do it anymore. That's probably not going to happen. This is a challenging thing to do, and it takes a bunch of time, and I don't know that I can commit to it every week going forward, but maybe even when we inevitably don't hit that 5,000 mark, I will continue to do this occasionally in the future. I don't think I'm going to buy into it all the time, add it to my weekly list of things to do, but I don't mind checking in and talking with y'all every now and then. So thank you so much, everyone, for watching. You can go ahead and try and save this segment. Try and get your friends to watch. Certainly, you can subscribe, like, do all those good things. Get us moving in the algorithm. That'll help this video get some traction. But for the time being, that's game.